wisdom, so I won't go to that section there if you're wondering what we'll talk about. James is the half-brother of Jesus Christ, same mother but different fathers, at least physically, even though James also has God as his father, which is kind of ironic. After James came to faith, after the resurrection of Jesus, Jesus himself went to his half-brother and said, "See, I told you, I am whom I said I was," and he went from being an unbeliever to, frankly, the head of the church. Just an amazing thing, and of course, the close proximity with his stepbrother, or half-brother, I should say, half-brother, pardon me, would have caused him to be able to be completely prepared, old camel knees, as he was, to be the leader of the church in Jerusalem. We said earlier when we were talking about it that when it addresses the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad at the end of verse 1, that Christianity hadn't really sprung into the world. Paul had not begun any of his missionary journeys yet, so it was for the most part a Jewish religion or a Jewish faith. So he is writing to believers, though. James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greetings. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have its perfecting work, that you may be perfect, which I'm translating as whole or completely mature, not without any error, of course, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask from God, who gives to all men generously, liberally, and without reproach, and it will be given unto him. Father, help us as we look into your word tonight. We thank you for the opportunity and the challenge to grow in our faith by growing in our patience. We ask it in Jesus' name, amen. You've often heard the sort of quaint idea that you better not pray for patience, because if you pray for patience, right, the Lord will give you trials and he'll answer that prayer all the time. I'm certain that that is the case. What I think is more interesting is just simply trying to define patience. Patience is so important in terms of the Christian life. It's the way that we manifest and demonstrate that we do believe. But more than that tonight, I want to give you a brand new thought about patience, not part of the lesson directly, but patience is one of the ways that we become like Christ. Jesus was a man as God when he came, who was extremely patient, and as James is writing in this book here, many of the characteristics he wants us to manifest are characteristics of Christ himself. In fact, I'm really believing that the majority of the book of James is in some way an exposition of the character of Jesus Christ as James viewed him, and says we ought to be like that also. So a definition of patience. I'll give you several, but this is the first one for a working definition. It is responding with grace, faith, and endurance when reality doesn't meet your expectations. Have you ever had that happen? Reality doesn't meet your expectations. You're expecting this, you're expecting that. Things don't go the way you want. You can't get through the red light, and the traffic is bad, or the car breaks down, or the money doesn't go to the end of the month, or whatever. And so reality has a way of coming back and biting you when you don't expect it. And so how do you respond? None of us responds as easily and as graciously as we ought to. But the Lord expects us to. He expects us to respond with grace and patience because we believe that God is in control. We believe that he's got it all figured out. And so, again, it is responding with grace, faith, and endurance when reality doesn't meet your expectations. And our expectations are not what has to happen, it's what God expects us to do. And so as an illustration, there was a missionary, and his name was Del, D-E-L, Del Tar, and he served in the sub-Sahara region in Africa, in the country of Sahel. Served there for several years, and as he was serving as a missionary, one of the things about that region is they didn't have much food. So very, very dry, very difficult. And every year they would anticipate, how in the world can we get enough food for our families? Before the year was over, it would end up being just eating in the evenings, once a day, just a little bit of food, just enough to keep the children happy. They would make these little balls of the kind of some grist that they would make and dip it in the sauce and send the kids to bed. One night, one of the moms said to the children, "Oh, I just really wish that we had some wheat that we could grind up and we could, give the children a good night's rest as they have a nice supper." And she says, "But there is none." And one of the children says, "Oh, but Mommy, there is some wheat. There's some wheat that's hanging up in the shed out in the granary area, and we could go grab that wheat and grind it up." And of course, the father said right away, "That's the wheat that we need to save for next year. And if we take our seed wheat and grind it and eat it now, we will certainly die of hunger." And so he was manifesting to her the importance of the fact that those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. He who continually goes forth weeping, bearing seed for sowing, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. And I just use that as an illustration to say, I'm not claiming that everything you're going through is easy. They're not. Many things are very difficult. And if you haven't faced something really difficult, you will. And we do. And so when we go through those times, we want to go forward with the kind of forward looking to understand that this is necessary and this will produce a positive outcome. I think James here in the text has given to us 4 responses, 4 things that we need to do if we are to grow our faith and become the kind of people that can be used by God. So I'll make you the list here real quickly. A couple of them we've already covered, and you'll make sense of it as we go along. The first thing that James says we have to do is count it all joy. And by counting, it means I have to grab a hold of my mind and lead it to the place of thinking this is joyful. We don't like trials and joy in them because we like pain. We do like them because we know that they do something, that they produce in us something better. And if you didn't respond this week in joy, not in your trials, but because of them, then I would encourage you that you have an opportunity to grow. And so next week when something happens, it will, look at yourself in the mirror and stop and say, am I responding in joy because the supper is late? Am I responding in joy because I hit my finger? Am I responding in joy in the difficulty? And if I'm not, why not? Well, the reason is I don't think I'm not believing that God can do something in it. So number 1, we have to lead our mind to choose joy. And number 2, we have to value or pursue an approved faith. He talks about it, and he says that when you go through it, knowing that patience, the testing of your faith produces patience. And so I want to test my faith. I want to make sure that it is true. None of us wants to think in our lives that maybe my faith will stand and maybe it will fall. And so James says, you want a faith that's tested. Third thing I need to do is simply, and this is tonight's lesson, frankly, it's to let patience do its work. Just let it. So if you're growing seeds and you put it in the ground, you just stand back, you water it, and you wait for it to grow. If you put yeast in the bread, you stand back and let the bread begin to rise. He wants us to let patience do its perfect work in my life. In other words, don't force it, don't push it. Just be submissive to God and be submissive to His will. Whatever He has brought is always for what? It's always for my good, and it's always for His glory. It's always the case. Count it all joy, value an approved faith, let patience have its perfect work, and then lastly, I need to value or prize Christian maturity. I need to not be satisfied with my level of my Christian walk. And way too many Christians are way too satisfied with where they are right now, including me. So I'm not just talking to people right here in the chairs or pews or whatever. I'm way too satisfied, and I think you're way too satisfied. We are with where we are. There's so much more that we could manage and develop, but it don't come easy. We never grow in good times, or seldom, I should say. We seldom grow in the good times. It only is a kind of growth when we go through trials and difficulties along the way. And so the Lord brings them into our lives because He wants us to grow. He wants us to be like Jesus. He wants us to manifest the same patience that Jesus Himself manifested. By the way, depending on which version you're using, this is probably very important. It's either translated as patience or endurance. And so I want to talk about the difference between those two, or at least the nuances between endurance or patience. So look down in your text if you're noticing. Does your version call it endurance or does it call it patience? There is a difference between the two, and I think both of them are necessary. Both of them should be included in what we're talking about. So the difference between the two of them is that endurance is being steadfast. Want to be steadfast. I want to be solid in my faith. I want to have a strength. One person described endurance like this. He said it is a courageous endurance. Shouldn't use the definition in the reading here, but courageous endurance which manly defies evil as an energetic resistance to hostile power. That's part of it. That's okay. Stand up, be courageous, endure, and that might be what he's saying here, that knowing that trials produce endurance. So if you're thinking of an athlete, how do you learn to run a 10-mile hike? I just sure miss seeing Don and talking to him. It was interesting to hear him talk about the first day of boot camp. Hello, gentlemen. The guy wakes up and sends him out the door. They're going to run 10 miles. And he says, man, the first 2 weeks, it was like we're dying, and it was terrible. And then before the end of it, he would say, Sergeant, can we run another 10? Can I do any more? And he'd say, Don, give me 20 push-ups. May I do another 20 or 30? Because after doing them, he got so much better at doing them. That's the way that it is in our Christian lives. God sends to us only what we can handle. He never sends us more than we can handle. And he sends those things our way so that we can grow, so that we can mature, so that when you face the bigger problem, so when he wants to use you more and in a greater way, then you're capable and able to handle those things. So it is endurance, but it would really, frankly, I think you would miss the point if all you view this word as is endurance, because it's endurance with a gracious attitude. So when I think of the word patience, I think of that which I sometimes have, when the dog barks or the kids are screaming in adventure club or whatever the case would be. And I'm always thankful that I'm not the person that has to manage all those things. There ought to be a gracious attitude in trial. And so if you were to ask your spouse, do I have a gracious attitude when things don't go my way? You might be in for a surprise, or you might know actually without even asking, or a friend, if you need to, that, yeah, you endure, but you're not really very gracious in it. And I think we haven't accomplished what James wants us to accomplish until we are steadfast here and we do it with a gracious, trusting, hoping spirit. How do I do that? Well, by believing that God is in control and that God is always working out those things for my good. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you several definitions of patience or endurance that I think could be helpful. And every one of these I got from someone else. So the reason I'm saying that is people seem to have different opinions or different ways of describing this idea of patience, because we want to have patience. It is not acceptable. It's not appropriate for us as believers, who should have all of the hope in the world, to be impatient with other people and not be willing to endure. So one person defined patience as the capacity to continue to bear up under difficult circumstances. That's a very good one. The capacity to continue to bear up under difficult circumstances. Another person said it's possessing endurance, fortitude, and a steadfastness. That's very good. Thirdly, responding with grace and endurance when, as you already heard, when reality doesn't meet your expectations. So when it doesn't go the way you want, do you grumble, grumble all day long? Or can you respond in grace? Fourthly, staying calm without excitement, without fear or passion, in the face of assaults to your destiny. I don't like that one as much, but I thought it was there. The ability to wait for God to vindicate you and to deliver you. So trusting in God, letting Him take care of your situation. And then the possession of a hope that endures. And I like that probably as much as any of them. The possession of a hope that endures in the midst of trials, because if I have hope, I'm going to respond in grace. I'm going to endure. I'm going to make it in the end. Let me give you a couple of examples of this idea of patience in the Bible. The Bible uses it in several different ways, and I think it's very helpful for us to think of them. Number one, patience is holding on to the gospel through the seasons of life. Holding on to the gospel. A couple examples of that. When Jesus gave the parable of the four soils, the one that was the good soil, it says, but the ones that fell on good ground, those are the ones who have heard the word, and with a noble and good heart, and they keep it and they bear fruit with patience, with endurance. So the gospel comes, it begins to grow, and they're patient along the way. In Luke 21, Jesus said, by your patience, possess your souls, which means persevere. Hang in there, keep trusting in the Lord. In the book of Hebrews, we're warned about losing our patience, and he says that you should not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience, or perseverance, or endurance, inherit the promises. So when you think of all of the individuals who ran the Hall of Fame of Faith, ran that race, they did it with perseverance, they did it with patience, they did it with endurance. Or as Paul says, this is my last one, to think about this, and whatever things were written before were written for our learning, so that means 78% of the Bible, right, is before Matthew 1:1. Every single sentence of the Old Testament was written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. And so this clearly can't be translated as endurance. This one has to be patience, a gracious attitude when we see how God was faithful in the lives of others. Secondly, patience and endurance is often the example that we're given as to follow Christ. And 2 Thessalonians 3:5. Now may the Lord direct your hearts in the love of God and into the patience of Christ. It's a strange little phrase, the patience of Christ. And I'll have to admit that I really haven't plumbed the depths of what that means. It might be referring to waiting for him, trusting in him, having endurance on his name. Or it could be talking about the patience he has. That the way that he manifested his life was a life of patience as he endured the contradiction of sinners. To Timothy, Paul told him when he is to have patience, he says, but you, O man of God, flee these things and pursue this, which is righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and gentleness. Or in the church, if there's any of us who are older men here, we get nailed on this one. He says that the older men would be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, sound in love, sound in patience, from Titus 2:2. Or John, when he is talking about being persecuted in the book of Revelation, he says, I, both your brother and companion in tribulation and the kingdom, and in the patience of Jesus Christ, was on the isle that is called Patmos. And so we are called to, by the way, to stay under the stuff, to remain where we are, because we value the idea that staying there, responding with a gracious attitude, gives us maturity. So let's talk about maturity. That's really where these first 4 verses go to. I don't think many people really know what maturity is. I don't think that it's something we talk about very much. I mentioned this in church just to throw it out there, just to kind of like seed your thoughts for a minute. Sunday morning, what's the difference between spirituality and maturity? So when a person is born again, are they spiritual? Well, yes, they are spiritual. They're completely spiritual. Every single person who is born again has the Spirit. Paul said it like this, Romans 8:9. But you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now, if anyone doesn't have the Spirit of Christ, then he is none of his. He is not his, Romans 8:9. So everyone is spiritual. So it can't be spirituality that we're talking about when we're looking for maturity. Or in 1 Corinthians 12:13, For by one Spirit we're all baptized into one body, whether Jew or Greek, whether slaves or free, and we've been made to drink into one Spirit. So it's not spirituality. It's not even being filled with the Spirit, which can come and go. It's this. Maturity takes time plus trials plus godly faith to produce Christian character. Let me repeat that again. Maturity takes time. A new believer will not be mature. They can be spiritual. They're probably more spiritual than you, probably more spiritual than we are because they're brand new in their faith and they're really, excited about it, but it doesn't mean they're mature. So it takes time plus trials plus godly faith to produce Christian maturity. I was listening to John MacArthur the other day. He's in his 80th year, 82nd or 8th decade is what I wanted to say. And he was talking about whether or not he would be looking for miracles. He says, people are talking every day, I want to see a miracle because I want to see the hand of God. And he says, I want to tell you, it's much more exciting to see the hand of God every day in my life. And he says, and I see his work, his hand in my life every single day. And I thought, well, I don't. Or at least I haven't thought through that. That's not where I am. And then I realized, well, one of the benefits of walking with the Lord for 8 decades and being in the Word is that you have time plus trials plus godly faith, and you see the hand of God in ways that you wouldn't otherwise. That's what Christian maturity is. And if you think about it for a minute, let's say that we go through some kind of really great trial, which we probably will, something unique along the way. Immediately, it's going to sort out or sift out who the leaders are, right? People are going to rise to the surface, and other people are going to fade and go to the periphery of life. We're going to look for people to follow, that people that are bold and courageous and not afraid. What's going to make the difference? Well, it's going to be what John talked about in 1 John chapter 2, when he says, I write unto you, fathers, because you've known him who is from the beginning. And the idea behind that is that, well, there are some people in the epistle of 1 John that they're newly saved and they're glad they're saved. And then there's the young men who are victorious and they're doing good. But there's a special class or a group of believers who know God, know him in a deeper way. And the reason that they know him is they've walked with him for many years. And that's what I, honestly, if you would say, well, if I would quit right now, would you understand anything that I wanted to say? That's it. We need to aim to be that kind of a person that people could say, I'm going to follow her or him because they've walked with God for years and I trust them. And even if I'm not exactly sure what my response would be, I've seen in their lives a pattern of faithfulness, that they've walked with God, that they understand God, and they're the people to follow. And so when Paul says, be followers of me as I am followers of Christ, that's the point. The years in Paul's life, and by the way, I think he had sort of an accelerated discipleship. I don't think it would have taken him as many years to mature as it takes me or other people along the way. He saw Christ, and that was a great thing. But it's a wonderful thing for those people who've reached that point. And every one of you tonight ought to say, I'm willing to go through the school of hard knocks, because that's what James is talking about here, to go through the trials, to put in the time, to respond with a gracious spirit so that when I face a trial, it doesn't throw me off my track, right? There's one preacher who used to talk about people who act like they've swallowed a gyroscope. I don't know if you know what a gyroscope is. I had a little one as a boy. You'd wind up a little string around this thing and give it a pull, and it always stood up straight. It would land on a table or on the floor, and it would go whoop, and it would come right back up, and there it was again. There are just people like that they always land on their feet in spiritual terms is what I mean here. That if I want to be that kind of a person, then I'm going to have to put in the time, I'm going to have to accept the trials, and I'm going to have to respond with joy in the midst of them and let God do his work in my life. Because what he's doing when he sends us a trial is he's chiseling away all of those things in my life that would be a distraction, that keep me from growing, so that I can become the kind of person that I need to be. And so when we think about maturity, let me define that for just a second. When you think of Christian perfection or maturity, whatever, as it's often defined here, it doesn't mean that you're without sin completely. Even and I've heard preachers really misunderstand. I'm convinced they get it wrong. When Jesus says in Matthew 5:48, therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect, and they just say, see, that's the standard. Standard is you got to have perfection. He's talking about loving one another. And he says, your Father is loved with a perfect love. And so you need to love with the perfect love in the same way. And so a perfect love is a love or a righteousness that's lacking nothing. Second example of that, when the rich young ruler had come to Jesus, Jesus said, you can be perfect, which is interesting, isn't it? If you want to be perfect, now he wasn't saying you're going to be perfect if you do this, but you're going to lack nothing. If you want to be perfect, go and sell what you have, give to the poor, and you will have treasures in heaven, and come and follow me. So obey those commands, respond to the wonderful invitation to be a disciple, to come and follow Jesus, to be a believer. Whenever you read the book of John, the Gospel of John, following means to believe. Following is believing. And so when he invites him to come and follow, it means to trust him and be his disciple. And he says he could be perfect, so lacking nothing. That's the point. One more example of that. He says in 1 Corinthians 2:6, however, we speak wisdom to those who are. Now, my version translates it as mature, but the word is perfect, same word, and it means not lacking wisdom to understand in life. So when he calls us to maturity, if you look down at it, in fact, I should read it again so that we don't miss it, verse 4. Allow patience to work its course in your life, if you will, but let patience have its perfecting work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. It's almost always used that way. The term perfection means to not be lacking. And so what would I be lacking in my Christian life if I don't respond to trials as I should? Well, I would be lacking the ability to endure. I mean, that's really what it's all about here. I would be lacking the ability to hang on. I would be lacking the ability to have this reminder. If you ever go through a big trial in life and you pass the test, you can always look at it in the future and think, oh, I've done this before. This isn't so bad. It's exactly what the Lord intends to do for you. Put you through your paces so that when you face a bigger trial, you can say, yeah, I can handle this because God was faithful the last time. We often look at Abraham and we think of his life. God tested Abraham multiple times, didn't he? Did you ever notice that every single time that the Lord tested Abraham, that his test got bigger and bigger and harder and harder? He had to leave his family at the beginning, and he did that. And then he had some difficulties with his wife, in which he lied about his half-sister, who was his wife, and she almost got in trouble, but the Lord rescued her. And then later on, he waited and waited and waited and waited, and God's promises didn't come. And so he took matters into his own hands at the insistence of his wife and failed that test. But the biggest test in his life was the offering up of his son. And so towards the end of his life, you would think, well, God doesn't need to test Abraham anymore. I mean, what a great guy. We don't want to be like him. He's an awesome person. But I can't think of exactly how old. He's way over 75. Seemed like he'd be about 90. I don't know. Oh, no, he'd be older than 90. He's older than 99. I know that now. In his hundreds years, he was in triple digits when the Lord tested him with his greatest trial, and he passed that test. Had he not passed the easier test earlier on, had he not found God faithful in smaller ways, he would have never been able to walk up on the mountain and say to his servants, you stay here because the two of us, we are going up. And remember what he said? And we are coming back. He had every intention of plunging his knife into his son Isaac. And he had all confidence that they were both going to return at the end of that day. How did he know that? Well, he was just thinking, well, the Lord was able to take this dead man and this wife. Virtually, we were halfway in the grave. We had one foot on a peel and the other in how do they say it? One foot on a banana peel and the other one in the grave. I'll get that right there. And the Lord allowed them to have a child. And so he experienced a resurrection in his life. And because he experienced that resurrection in his own life, in his wife's life, then he knew in the end that God was able to raise up his son. And I'm completely convinced that he intended to sacrifice that child and completely believed that God would raise him up because God grew his faith because he responded correctly in trials. And so here's the point, just a couple of things to conclude for the day. There are things in your life that God intends to do, characteristics he wants to develop in you that can only come through trials. That's it. It's the only way. It can only come through trials. And when we go through the trials and the Lord makes us more capable and more mature and more ready to stand, then he can use us. Think about what Paul said when he thought about the trials. He went to the Lord and he just begged the Lord 3 times that he would take away a trial, whatever it was. We're not told exactly what it was. But the Lord responded and he says, my grace is sufficient. In other words, more than enough for you. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities. Now, all of a sudden, when you hear him say that he will gladly or more abundantly boast in his infirmities, does that sound like any passage we've ever read before? Something like, count it all joy whenever you fall into various trials. That's exactly the same thing. He was thanking the Lord for the thorn in the flesh, for his difficulties, because with those, what did God do? Well, let me read it. That the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasures. I'm not ready to say this yet, but I'm ready to admit that it's what I ought to say. I take pleasures in infirmities. I take pleasures in reproaches. Isn't it nice when people make fun of you, rebuff you? You go to hand them a gospel tract or talk to them about Jesus and they make you look like an idiot or you feel like you did. Paul says he takes pleasure in that. I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches. I take pleasure in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. Israel never would have known about the glory of God and the strength of God if they hadn't stood between the mountains and the sea, wondering what God would do. David never would have known about the ability of God to rescue him and deliver him if he didn't face a Goliath out in the valley that day. Joshua would have never known the power of God to rescue him, tear down Jerichos, if he didn't face foes that were impossible for them to face on their own. And the same thing is true for us. So I'd like for you to bake a cake with me in conclusion. This cake of Christian maturity whereby we can become more fruitful and more useful to God only takes 4 simple ingredients. It takes the ingredient of considering or counting every trial joy, not in the trial, but because of what it does. It takes a person who is willing to pursue and look for a stronger faith. It takes a person who is willing to let God work in their life. Now, when we say let patience have its perfect work, you do realize that's what they call a divine passive. The point is, when it doesn't say who's doing it, it's God. If I let patience have its perfect work, it's let God put me through the paces to make me what I need to be. And then the fourth and final element is pursue and prize the idea of Christian maturity. I don't want to go to heaven not any better than I am right now. And I expect the Lord will give me a couple of trials so that doesn't happen. And I'm hoping to respond as you are, as we should. Maturing is a strength of soul. You've not heard that one yet tonight. Maturity is a strength of soul that has come to a saint through time and trials by which we now instinctively respond to great difficulties with quiet faith, because we have come to be convinced that God is trustworthy and that he is faithful. May that be the testimony of our life. Thank you, Father, for this evening, the opportunity to consider our level of patience and our willingness to allow you to meddle in our lives, to whittle off the rough edges and sand off and smooth those things which are displeasing to you. We want to do it because we want to be a vessel that is fit for the Master's use. We want to be one that can be more fruitful. And in the end, that we would be able to say that we took the talents, the skills, and the resources that you gave, and we invested them, and you, by your grace, honed them in our lives to be that which is most wonderful, so that we could give you the most praise when we see you face to face. Or just simply, I pray that you'd help us to be more patient in the simple way that we would think of it in English, that we would be able to respond graciously in our trials, because that's what Jesus did. We want to be like him, that we would respond graciously because it's how you produce in us greater maturity, and that we would respond with a gracious endurance because we want to be all that you intend for us. We thank you that we are your workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which you have before ordained that we should walk in them. Thank you for using us for your glory. Help us to have the patience of Jesus.